And now we're in.
Welcome to Talking in Stations, a podcast about EVE Online. I am Matterall. I'm here with... I am here with Dirk McGurk. How's it going, Dirk?
Hey, good morning, Matterall. How are you? Happy New Year, my friend.
Happy New Year. That's right. This is New Year's Eve. We'll try to keep... and pronunciations. We also have Elise Randolph for a bit. How's it going, Elise?
Oh, pretty good. Happy New Year, everyone.
And McLeod, our evergreen engineer.
Hello.
So this is what we're doing today, and this is a special broadcast. It's the year-end show. We're closing out 2019. We're closing our first year as an independent group, having our own station, running our own show, no longer part of anybody else. Imperium News is where we started. And we thought, I want to have a situation where we just talk about EVE Online from memory with players that I like talking to, and try to go back and put the decade into some kind of context. And we also want to highlight some players and then maybe pick the most influential player and most influential group, and actually most influential event later on in the show. So first I'll go with some stats. I just want to congratulate everybody at Talking in Stations that has done so much over the years, especially this year in 2019, where we put together 96 official shows, including this one. That doesn't include the whole story, which Exuki put together too, the money show that we do, a lot of the specials that we did, and a lot of the CSM interviews that we did as well. So 96 is a pretty big number. If we put it all together, it's over 150 shows in 1 year. And if we look at Talking in Stations for its 3-year run, basically almost 4-year run now, that's a total of 254 shows. So you can see that nearly or more than 1/3 of the shows were done in 2019. It's a big effort with a lot of people involved. And I want to thank everybody for showing up all the time and doing them, especially McLeod here, who, regardless of who's hosting, he's the guy showing up, putting the show on. So that's a big effort.
Yeah, it's all right, dude.
In that time, our viewership has grown and grown and grown, and we've essentially, our goal was to have 6,000 viewers, listeners, and if we put together Twitch and YouTube, and of course our podcast, which is about 2/3 our listener base, we reached about an average of 6,500 listeners per episode. And that's an average for both shows in 2019. And that was about September we hit that. That is a lot of content for a lot of people. If I calculate the hours looking at the podcast, it's over 400,000. Actually, it's like 450,000 listens to Talking in Stations. And now it's time to put it all away. I'm just kidding. We're done. We did it.
This is the last episode of Talking in Stations.
This is the very last episode of...
I want to hit 500,000. That would be amazing to say 500,000, listens in a year.
Well, that's 2019. That 450,000. If we calculate all the podcasts, I think it goes way up over 600-some thousand listens.
Very nice.
Yeah, so it's a big number. It's a big number. All of it dedicated to EVE Online, and I want to thank CCP for supporting us and giving us exposure and helping us out here and there with information, and also, of course, all the guests that showed up and kind of made the place what it is, right? Because the real trick of this is getting a combination of people that are fun to listen to, that can break it down for the audience, and the experts that actually know just how deep these things go. And very rarely do you find a combination of both, but we do in people like Carneros and when people like Elise Randolph here, who's with us. They're in the mud. Okay, so that's Tugging in Stations, a little bit of review. We're doing great. We have so much that we're going to do in this next year. It's going to be very diversified. You're going to hear a lot of voices. We're literally going to become different voices talking in stations. It's we'll be the station, but we'll hear a lot of different voices coming from every direction. All right, but we're at the end of the year, but we're also at the end of the decade. Dirk, you and I were talking about the 2010s.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, it was like when I was looking to I don't know, talk about some stuff the other night. I went and began to try and do a bit of work just looking back, because when you look at where this decade began, right? So January 1st, 2010, right? It was very much right at the beginning of a number of changes that I think have translated, a lot over the course of this decade, right? But it's kind of nice to go back and look at, well, where did we begin, right? We were less than a year out from the end of the Great War, right? Bob being, basically disbanded, right? And the end of the Great War. Why can't I hear Matt at all now?
Oh, because I didn't push the talk.
Okay. But, we're less than a year out from the introduction of wormholes. So wormholes hadn't become this settled thing. They did exist, but they'd been around for less than a year, at that point. Just before the beginning of the decade, literally less than a month before the beginning of the decade kicked off, is when we shifted over from pause warfare for sovereignty, right, into the new Dominion sovereignty system. Right, the inclusion of things like iHubs, the inclusion, the changeover from motherships to supercarriers, and the change to, from an area of effect doomsday for Titans to just the finger of death, or whatever you want to call it. So I mean, we had a number of things at that time that were shifting substantially in the game, as well as just the overall sort of transition. And Elise would probably be able to speak to kind of really what was going on out there at a higher level, because of those changes. But I mean, it was a pretty significant time for to begin what is now this decade.
So yeah, if you look at the beginning of the decade, it's kind of like this. It's this really bizarre foreign thing, but it's also kind of looks very familiar to what it's like. So as Dirk was saying, like all the big war was over, right? The Band of Brothers versus the Northern forces, that huge forever hell war is over. At the start of the decade, you also have a cartoon disbanding Goon Fleet.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
And so they don't exist. They're living in Declan on Tau Ceti Federation, which is a predominantly French alliance. Goons are living without Sov in Declan on TCF's couch.
Or even
They're
before
not a power player at all.
Sorry, Elise, but even before that, right after they get messed up, they almost call it quits, but they end up in Syndicate, where they're getting beat up by small groups. Like little alliances were beating up Goon Swarm. At that time, they were called something else, some ridiculously long name that I don't remember.
Solo Drac Ban. So it was actually Solo Drac Ban, Solo Drac, because they couldn't fit Solo Drac Ban again. Solo Drac Ban was the IT guy for the Goonswarm guys, and they voted on an alliance name just to meme, and because they were funny guys, they decided to go for Solo Drac Ban. And yeah, they were living in Cloud Ring and Outer Ring and Syndicate and getting beat up. Colonel Freeze, which is he went on to do quite a few big things. Back then, he was in Solo Drac Ban / Goonswarm. And he was leading a campaign there to like very little success. People didn't want to log in. Atlas still existed against all authority. AAA still existed.
Yeah.
Over there in drones, you had X-Death and Solar Fleet, who are still friends. And the North was like this big, huge group that was by many considered to be too big to fall. And you have IT Alliance slowly rebuilding in Delft. And they're going to go on to do some things for a while. But yeah, the map seems, it's like, so the map is split up into this north-south thing, where the people in the north are friends with people, are forever enemies with the people in the South, which kind of reminiscent of exactly what it's like today.
And one of the other kind of like I'll call it mechanical things that was different yet about to change at that time, right? Was okay. So the player outposts, right? What we called player stations and things like that, right? We hadn't gone through the expansion of those things. Like you could build these things, but they were difficult. It was really hard to kind of move move what you needed to move out there and freighters and things like that. Because it was still ahead. We still had a few months to go before the Tyrannus expansion hit, where planetary interaction was introduced. So, I mean, again, the number of things that were wholesale different at that time versus kind of what we've seen iterated on since then is really significant.
So what was about to happen after? So that's the setting, right? We're coming out of this basically major war between two powers, at least in Western eyes, right? There's a whole Russian thing going on. Russians were at this point a very big part of the game. There was no Chinese players or Korean players, and that was kind of being settled. It settled in February 2009, and so now we're in like 2010-ish, and people are. What's going on at this point?
So I can speak to at least my personal history, because this is kind of when I, as a player, start taking a bigger role in EVE Online. I'm out of college, so I can I'm in an area in college where I can goof around quite a lot more, I should say. So I have more free time. The decade from 2010 starts for me with PL kicking my corp out of the Alliance. Shadu is nowhere to be found after the war in the South, where they defeat Band of Brothers.
Well, he wasn't born yet, or he was?
No, Shadu is taking a break, and so Shadu is just gone. And so for PL, it seems like all is lost. We lost Fountain to IT Alliance coming back. I get kicked out. I joined some group called Cry Havoc.
Yeah, I remember them.
And I start to FC and do stuff like that. But the big pivotal moment is the people in the North, this powerhouse that's seen as too big to fall. They start looking over to their right, and they see this group of Russians, and they say, "Hey, this is going to be quite a lot of fun. Let's just go lead some fleets into their space and start attacking them, because it's just content, easy content, right on our doorstep, so it's easy to access." And this sets the stage for what would then be like the beginning of the decade, like the new huge fight that would go on to establish dozens of groups. It's actually a huge turning point in EVE Online, the like ripples of which we can still see coming today. And I'm sure there's other stuff that happened, but for me, that's the big bad, and that happens around 2011, 2012.
Are we talking about the Northern Coalition versus Drone Russian Federation war?
Yeah, this starts at the beginning of the decade when like a junior FC from Morsis Mihi goes over to LXQ and starts taking space.
Was that Rat Salat? Who was that?
I can't remember his name. It's not Rat, but it was someone else.
All right.
I've been struggling to remember his name for such a long time, but
a junior guy.
A junior guy goes over there and starts messing with the drones, and this becomes like a catalyst.
And this was one of the things I was kind of looking at when I was going to do my look back and kind of where it began, because my recollection of the first half of this decade was basically a ongoing series of what at that time were fairly significant conflicts. We're not saying that they were completely global in scale, like the Great War, but these were some fairly substantial conflicts that were taking place. And it basically began in about September of 2010, I think it was, with what was going on with the Northern Coalition, right, versus the Drone Russian Federation. Guys like Raiden, White Noise, and Legion of X-Death, Shadow of X-Death, that whole group, right. When we talk about capital fights, right, over the course of the next couple of years, this was substantial at that time. I mean, that group from the drone Russian Federation, what they were fielding out there at the time in terms of supers and titans was, I mean, it was scary. And Elise, I mean, you would again, have better recollection of it, but it was not something I think that we had seen before in that kind of mass numbers.
Yeah. So when the NC, which is not Northern Coalition, thought that we talk about now, that name actually comes as a
meme name,
like a mockery of the coalition that used to live in the north, and they used to be the biggest, baddest group, too big to fall, all that. Led by Voklau. So, that's a name that people probably remember from the first decade of EVE Online.
Yeah.
So they attack the drones, and then the drone people get together and they say, wow, our way of life is, in danger. We have to put aside our differences and fight together in order to survive. And the entire Russian time zone comes together and they lick eyes south, where Atlas Alliance lives. Bobby Atlas, one of the most charismatic leaders EVE Online has ever seen. Famously, Elonitis is a disciple of Bobby Atlas.
That's right, yeah.
If you look at Bobby Atlas's FC tree, you'll see quite a few big names there. So the drones look south and they say, okay, let's go take Atlas space. Let's get our allies and comrades some space where they can live and make some money. So they look south, they decimate Atlas Alliance, this massive alliance that seems like they're just like this powerhouse of FCs and pilots. And they're helped out by a little alliance called Pandemic Legion, who's trying to make a name for themselves as mercenaries. This is their second mercenary contract. By now, Shadu has returned, and he's brought with him AHACs, which we kind of theory crafted. And so we use those AHACs to just beat out Atlas Alliance. And of course, we use the might of the Russians. So the Russians would alarm clock, come on in and beat Atlas in crucial fights. And so that was from 2010 to 2011. And so then more of the Russian alliances take some space, take a lot of assets down there, start making money. And unbeknownst to the rest of New Eden, Legion of Exdeath had been sitting in drone lands, this area of space that everyone thought was shit because at the time, the NPCs were rogue drones that had no bounty on them, and all they did was drop these minerals. So the Legion of Exdeath, UA Exdeath himself, put the plan together and said, hey, this space isn't worthless. I'm going to take my people here. We're going to put on a lot of outposts. We're going to put a modest tax on it. And everyone that comes in here to live with us and other people that we'll invite, they don't have to pay anything, but they do have to pay this tax when they refine all of their NPC droppings. So, and those turn into minerals. So Exdeath had just gajillions of minerals lying around, and they turned those silently into super caps and capitals.
Yeah, I mean, when I first began EVE, after a little bit of time, and then actually the first place I went into was out in the drone regions, as part of Intrepid Crossing, actually, and they held space out there along with Ethereal Dawn and some others, right? But there was still a heavy Russian presence out there. That entire east out there, basically the overlords of it, were the Russians in terms of Solar Fleet and Red Alliance and Legion of Exdeath, and Legion came out of Red.
Pandemic Legion?
No, Legion of Exdeath.
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think they all started in Curse. Then Red came out, and then Legion of Exdeath was a break off of Red Alliance.
Yeah, so there was a heavy Russian presence out there, and then of course, yes, as somebody out there said, basically the rise of the rental empire, right? When you think back to sort of the origins of substantial rental empires. That drone regions area and some places south of there, were really the origins, of the big rental empire, which will come back later in the decade in various ways. But they had big control. And again, you go back to the prior decade, right? Where the Russians of the East, were working, with the fledgling goons and things like that. So they were a huge power out there. But the difference in terms of kind of like the drone poo, right? The drone alloys and things like that, right? Which only got better actually in years ahead than they had been at that time, really provided for a lot of that gun mining that led to the ability to build a lot of capitals and supers.
Yeah, so gun mining is when you shoot these drones, you actually get the minerals, and so that's why it was mining. But you were getting minerals, but you were mining them out of drones, not out of rocks with mining lasers.
Another crucial thing that happened that a lot of people forget is so at the time that all of the T2 production came from money moons, more or less. So you would have to harvest resources from moons. And the choke point of those minerals previously was promethium dysprosium. And there was a lot of prom and dyspro in Fountain, in Delft, that entire area. The south seemed to have quite a lot of it. And the north, they had some, but not nearly as much. That moved over to technetium. CCP made some adjustments, said, hey, prom and dyspro, they're still going to be useful, but technetium is now that choke point, or that crucial element that you need. And the north was full of it. The north had a disproportionate amount of technetium for some reason or another. And so the group that was living in the north, the Northern Coalition, they were getting so rich. So at the time, they just seemed, not only did they have the biggest capital fleet, the biggest super capital fleet, all of the FCs you can imagine, like all of the big named FCs were in the Northern Coalition. They had it all, and they even had this cache of money that was just floating into them. So when we talk about when the Northern Coalition went and shot the Russians, actually shot the Legion of Exdeath space, which polarized the Russians to fight back and become a big group. These Russians really thought that they were going to die horribly. So in 2011, they start their counteroffensive. And they hire 3 groups to work with them. So they hire Evoke, which is a largely Russian group. Mm-hmm. They hire Pandemic Legion, and they hire Vince Draken's new group, because Vince Draken used to be in Tri, and a little bit in PL, but mostly Tri. Their new group, who named themselves after a meme, Northern Coalition Dot. So Exdeath went to these 3 groups and said, hey, we're going to be fighting in this area, in Geminate, and we're going to just push through the north. What we want you to do is we want you to soften up the back, and you can take as many money moons as you want, and you can keep them forever. So you're talking about just Venal itself, which is an NPC area, had 90 of these money moons that would make 5 billion ISK to 10 billion ISK a month each. So they said, okay, you guys just go out. You can be independent. You can shoot us if you want. We don't care. Just take these moons from our enemy and create some chaos in the back lines. So when we fight them, they have to, make a decision. And so that was the tactic. And then every once in a while for big timers, it'd say, hey, you have to come and help us, yada, yada, yada. But that's when the DRF, the Drone Russian Federation, really started in earnest to make their moves into this unbeatable foe of the Northern Coalition. And it took like 8 months of fighting, but they finally did it. They finally pushed over and kind of crucially stopped right where Declan begins, which is now Goonswarm Federation space.
Right,
and Goonswarm.
Talk about what happened with Goonswarm and the couch they were sleeping on with Tau Ceti.
Yeah, so Goonswarm were chilling with TCF in Declan. TCF gave them a couch to lay on. Then TCF kind of folded up. They said, hey, we don't really need this anymore. So Goonswarm ended up taking over Declan, and this is where the Mittani also becomes the leader of Goonswarm. He sets some pretty I don't want to say strict rules, but he throws some organization into these hapless dudes who are just kind of goofing around, and he makes them an actual powerhouse with Mr. V, who is one of the EVE Online's. If you're gonna have a power ranking of best FCs the game has ever seen, I think everyone would have Mr. V somewhere in the top 3. But he was in Goonswarm, so they had a lot of might behind him. So they settled in Declan. They gave a little bit of space to some hapless guys from Reddit called Test Alliance, who we'll see later. But Goonswarm Federation chills in Declan, and it becomes like this really hard-nosed PvP group as well. They decide that while the rest of the game were flying whatever they wanted to. So Morsis Mihi, if you called for a fleet, you would call for like armor battleships. Someone could take a Dominic, someone could take a Megathron, someone could take whatever the hell an APOC. It didn't matter. They didn't care. But Goonswarm at the time said, hey, we're going to copy these smaller guys, these like PLs of the world, and we're going to make all of our line members fly Maelstroms. We're going to make them have this cohesive doctrine to fly, which was unheard of at the time for a large alliance. But Goonswarm starts growing, and they start helping out their Northern Coalition friends, or their friends in the Northern Coalition. But they don't fully commit because they didn't really like the way Northern Coalition was going. They were part of the Northern Coalition, and they could see the writing on the wall that these guys were probably going to fall, that these guys were bloated beyond belief, that people were, stealing assets from one another. So Goonswarm helped their allies, but also distanced themselves at the same time, which is a masterstroke from the Mittani, probably his first like diplomatic masterstroke.
Yeah, because they didn't really commit into some of the larger battles up there that were kind of consequential, right? And they certainly didn't commit on necessarily the capital side of the equation. I don't think in anything, and it was weird, right? Because they were up there, they were on the couch, they were fundamentally part of the Northern Coalition, but then the Northern Coalition sort of gets rolled while they are one of the beneficiaries of it in the end.
Yeah, so if we fast forward a little bit, like no one really cares about the fighting of a thing that happened 10 years ago, except for probably me. This is where I become an FC, and I love it. Like I'm in every single fight. It's amazing. This is the golden era of EVE Online for me personally.
There was some good fighting though. You can't ignore that. The fights were. This is before tie-dye, I believe.
Yeah, this is before tie-dye existed. There were just some clowny things. Yep. The biggest fight ever happens in MTAC O. Which the leader of the MC just says, screw it, we're jumping in any. They black screen, madness happens. There are hundreds of dozens of examples where Super Capital Fleet gets caught dead to rights and they all just have to log off in shame. But the TLDR is the DRF, with the help of Evoke, Northern Coalition Dot, and Pandemic Legion. They take everything in the North has. They crush everything they've had. Morsis Mihi, this group that's been around since beta, is in shambles. Razor, this group that's been around since beta, is in shambles. Majesta collapses. All of these groups are just gone. And crucially, they stop at the border to Declan.
That's right.
They say, okay, we're turning off our war machine. PL, NC. Evoke, if you want to keep going, sure, but we're not going to help you. So white noise settles in like Tinal and that area. And Legion of Exeth says, okay, well, we took all this space. We don't want it. We're pulling back to our own borders, and we're leaving this glassed wasteland to whoever wants it. So, PL, NC. They have a bunch of money moons here now. So they settle here in some aspects and continue poking Goonswarm. But Goonswarm comes back. PL makes... and this is my first campaign ever that gets hijacked from me because I'm too junior. So it gets hijacked from me, and the groups decide to go into Declan and finish Goonswarm off once and for all. So they go into Declan, they go to VFK, and they try to headshot VFK's system. And this is where goons sound the horn of Gondor, come back, have this like week-long hell camp of the area with like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people online 23 hours a day to make sure that VFK, to make sure Mittanigrad does not fall. And so in the background,
siege of Mittanigrad.
Exactly. So PL, NC Dot, all them, they fail, they leave, they say, you know what, whatever, we're gonna stick in Vino with our money moons. Screw fighting these goons, it's not fun. They rescue all of their super caps. They kill 2 supers on the way out. They smug. And so Goonswarm is now sitting in the north with this huge power vacuum to their right, with these annoying mercenaries sitting in NPC space that they cannot evict, and just shambles town all over the place. So they say, you know what? This is a real clusterfuck. Let's make a coalition. Let's start the coalition ourselves, and they're going to call it the Clusterfuck Coalition, the CFC. So they pick up the pieces of every group that died. They say, hey, you can come. You can live in the north together with us. We'll provide the military might, and we'll integrate you as best as we can. But it's not going to be like life in the north that you remember. It's going to be life in the north on our terms. It's going to be like friendly. We're going to treat you guys as equals, but you can't goof around. You can't have these weird power plays. You can't take money from one another. You can't have bickering. We're going to do this together. Mm-hmm. And so this is the foundations of what becomes EVE Online, like the next decade's huge power group.
And in this, and there's a little nascent group in this that's under this umbrella of organization called Test Alliance that's being born around this time.
Exactly, yeah. So Test Alliance, they've been living in an area of Declan that Goonswarm has, given them. It's their couch. Goonswarm had been the recipient of a couch to sleep on before. So they give this little area of space to Test Alliance called the Testagram. If you look at the way it lays out, it's a pentagram, so they called it the Testagram. And so during this thing, Test says, well, this is great. We like being part of the CFC, but we want something more. So I believe it's Montolio at the time, the leading Test Alliance. Mm-hmm. They break off from Goonswarm's couch, and they take this other space further to the south in Fountain. And so they're like, okay, well, we're kind of CFC, but we're kind of our own independent group as well. We're friendly with you guys in Goonswarm, but we also want our own space in Fountain. So Tappy at the time take Fountain.
Hold on, let me insert at the same time the Northern War is happening. We're going to go back a little bit to what's going on in the South, and there are some groups trying to take Sov with AAA's help, and Pandemic Legion's on contract too to help usher in some people into Scalding Pass and these kind of, would you call them beginner areas like Scalding Pass? And
yeah, it's space that like nobody has very little value to most people. So like people don't necessarily want it, but yeah.
Well, and hold on, but before we get that far ahead, I just want to back up a little bit because I want Elise to put a little bit of color on somebody who was highly active at the time. I think it's a name that has come up a lot. The influence of Vile Rat at that time, not just necessarily within Goons or the CFC, but kind of what he helped to form on a broader basis. Can you speak to that at all?
So I was on the CSM with Vile Rat, CSM 6. So it was the Batani as the chair of the CSM. I believe Celine there, or Celine maybe came the next year. Anyways, Vile Rat was there. That was my first introduction to him. And he introduced himself as the CFC's head diplomat. I was like, okay, what does that mean? So I spoke to him at length a lot of times in CSM channels, because that's kind of what you do in the CSM, at least at the time. And he was like, so all these little pieces together, all these little hapless little groups, I bring them together and I settle all the disputes that they have. So I gave the credit to the Mittani early because I believe it was probably his idea, but Vile Rat was the guy on the ground that made it happen, that made the CFC function on a day-to-day level. He wasn't alone. Obviously, there there were people with him that helped, but he was the main driving force behind settling diplomatic disputes and making sure that people were on the same page in this thing called the CFC.
But now it also went beyond the CFC, right? Like there was sort of at this time an expansion of, let's call it, diplomatic, machinery put in place out there, even more broadly, right? Across to both neutrals as well as enemies alike, right? There was sort of a, let's call it a back room.
Yeah, so and we actually talked about it a little bit on our Sunday show. So there was a channel after the war in the South happened that Goonswarm hosted called Jabberlon 5, and Jabberlon was a jabber group with all of the the FCs and main movers and shakers from all over Eve, and they were all in this one Goonswarm hosted jabber channel. So there was like this constant dialogue running between Goonswarm and just FCs from all these groups. So you have this diplomatic situation where Goonswarm are what's left over from the old Northern Coalition. They're picking up the pieces, and they're also, they're also friends with, in a way, a lot of FCs from Pandemic Legion, a lot of FCs from groups like Northern Coalition, a lot of FCs from the South, a lot of FCs from the Legion of X-Death. And so they kind of create this system where...
I don't want to call it the United Nations, but...
Well, it's based on Babylon 5, the TV show, right? Which is a station where everybody can meet. It's like neutral ground.
Exactly. So it's... Goonswarm kind of paint themselves as the main political movers and shakers, and they also put themselves in a situation where no one really wants to attack them, right? They come up with interesting ways to do this. So they say, hey, PL, you're living in Venal. We won't touch these 90 money moons that we want if you don't touch any of our stuff. And we're like, okay, sounds fair. I like that. And so you have these adversaries that aren't really adversaries. In a sense, and this is like the main... Exactly. This is kind of, as much as people dislike it, but this is kind of like the main driving force in how EVE Online nullsec blocks operate throughout the rest of the decade, where they might have wars between one another, but there are also agreements put in place and diplomatic ties where these groups don't necessarily want to kill each other at the same time. So they have something going on the side.
So now, in kind of the aftermath of the DRF Northern Coalition War in the North, and then some of what falls out from that, also in 2011, you've got what became known as the Delft Thunderdome, right? It was sort of this just... I don't want to call it open area, but it was definitely being fought for by a number of people. I was looking back on this a bit, and one of the things that just sort of struck me was 2011. Alpha Star Pilot's name comes up, and I go, "Oh my God, was he like 10 at that time?"
Man, he was like, I think he was 13, and I remember being on his fleet.
Talking like this.
Yeah, he had this he was just a super young kid.
I mean, names like Nully Secunda, Cascade Imminent. Archibald Hornsby was Cascade Imminent, wasn't he? I was trying to remember.
I think it's Manfred Sidious was one of the.
Was he also there?
Group. Yeah, I think he actually. I think he named the alliance.
Lucian James. Yeah, but anyways, so you've got this big thing going on down there, right? That goes on for a while as people are just sort of slugging it out for. And I think a number of these people are ones that kind of fell out from elsewhere, right?
Hold on, before we get to Thunderdome, I'm sorry to cut you off. I did want to hit the South though, because we've been talking about goons and everybody in the North, but in the South, around the same time this is happening, you have CVA hitting against all authorities a little too hard. I think there was some complications there in their relationship, because CVA kind of lived at the behest of against all authorities who were AAA, who were really strong in the South there. And so they rolled into CVA Do I have this right? Or CVA actually is attacked. No, I forget. It's getting to be too far. But
so the initiative, actually, this is kind of one of the first areas where the initiative.
The initiative, by the way, is a smaller alliance that's under the umbrella, or their pets, basically, to IT Alliance, which is former Band of Brothers. But go ahead.
So the initiative, after IT falls and after Goonswarm create this CFC, start making the CFC in the north, and after, they didn't play that big of a role, and not to dismiss them, but they didn't play like a huge role in the DRF versus NC fight. But what they did do after the fact is they said, hey, we want some content. We want to get some FCs, some experience, because at the time they were pretty small. And they start taking AAA space. They start taking space in catch. They start fighting CVA a little bit, but their big goal is to fight AAA. And so it starts this kind of little war in the South that goes on, that more and more people get involved with. AAA lose space, they retreat to Stain, they come back, they take initiative space, initiative takes it again, AAA comes back again, but it creates this like little hotbed of action in the South where all eyes are kind of focused.
Yeah, there's a lot of turnover going on there. I think PL's on contract helping usher in groups like Initiative. GigX is there with CO2.
Yeah, PL is on contract to help the initiative, mostly just to fight AAA, because the DRF, they're united Russians with the exception of AAA. AAA said, you guys suck. We don't want anything to do with you. And there's actually, like, I'm sure within the Russian community, people can attest to this a little bit more, but this is kind of the start of a huge Russian split and divide that starts with AAA. But yeah, so PL gets the contract to work in the South and push out AAA. And then we say, hey, we look over to Delft, which is mostly unaffiliated space. And this is what Dirk was getting into.
Right.
The Delft Thunderdome.
Right before you get into that, you had Red Overlord was down there with the Stain Wagon group too. Is there anything notable about Red Overlord? Didn't they have like
so they're a storied alliance that split off from other Russian groups, and this is where they try and make their name again. They say, hey, you know what? Just like AAA, they ally with AAA, and they eventually call themselves Stain Wagon because they all kind of base in Stain. They say, hey, you know what? We're going to work with these guys in AAA, and we're going to get back our former glory, and we're going to start by taking areas of Delft that are mostly just inhabited by small groups of players. There's Cascade Eminent, who are pets of AAA. There's Nully Secunda, who are pets of AAA. But there's like a diplomatic breakdown, and Red Overlords say, hey, you know what? We're gonna start taking some of this space from these guys.
Right. So this is when Nully Secunda is born, and you have this new FC called Pro God Legend, who's their key FC, one of their key FCs. Actually, probably their key, and they're basically a subcap group. They don't do a lot of capital stuff.
So Pro God Legend is their U.S. time zone force, and then there's a guy who moved over from Evoke, named Killaby, who is their lead FC in the EU time zone, and his name will kind of appear over and over again through the rest of the day.
Well, at this time, Killaby's actually in Black Legion, I think. He wasn't in Nully at the time.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I think he comes a little bit later. So it's mostly Pro God. There's a few FCs that people haven't heard of. There was one other counterpart that he had that was kind of the Cap FC, and I forgot his name. Sorry, he's a Texan guy, and he was very slow talking. But yeah, so they end up starting this new venture in Nully Secunda, and they end up in Delft because Delft's given to them by AAA. But it turns out Delft is going to become a very crowded space, and it's going to become an arena to just fight like crazy. And PL is going to be in there, and later Morsis Mihi as their refugees from the north. But go ahead.
So yeah, we can do a little quick TLDR. There are two areas there are 2 times within like a 2-year period where Delve becomes like this hotbed of action. But in this first one, which is like towards the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, there's a lot of fighting going on in Delve. And Test Alliance, living in Fountain at the time, say, hey, let's go do stuff on our own. Let's go fight down here and have some fun. We don't need to be part of, we can be independent of CFC. We can be our own dudes, and we can grow. So they team up with Pandemic Legion and some other groups, and together they start fighting in Delve, and they start pushing out the people that are there. At the time, the meta in EVE Online is to fly Drakes all the time. Pandemic Legion becomes the first group to realize that, hey, these nerfed Titans, if you put dread guns on them and all tracking mods, you can 2-shot Drakes. So that's what PL starts to do. They fly Abaddons and Blap Titans, and they
Blap
start
Titans.
Just killing 600 Drakes a day, which sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. There were actually like 600 Drake kills on a single Saturday and Sunday every week for like 2 months.
I just want to back up a little bit because isn't the original Delft Thunderdome more in the 2011 like 2011 period?
I don't think so, but
I was living there.
I mean, there are a few times where Delve becomes.
I thought it happened before the Russian Civil War, where that stuff was going, because it was almost part of the fallout of what had happened in the north, and then sort of some of the other skirmishing going on.
It was actually going on before that. Morsis Mihi came down. You're right, that did happen, but what happened was that it was a place given to Nulli Segunda. Nulli Segunda had most of it, and they were farming really well because this certain sanctum was broken, and so they were farming like crazy. And so then I think what happened is Morsis Mihi came down, and other groups came down to fight because it was kind of fun to fight. And I think that's actually where ProGod was maybe at his best. He was like a star quarterback. We were doing really, really well against PL, which is unusual. But then you had like Morsis Mihi come down, and they didn't last very long. Like they couldn't get anything going. And then a bit later, you have Red Alliance is given half of Delve by AAA. And that's where you have a real war between Red Alliance and Nulli Segunda over Delve. And that gets interrupted by Test, who comes down and starts fighting in there as well. And Test is
the reason that we get so confused about what happens in Delve is because there's this massive power vacuum in an area of space that's incredibly valuable, and also close to Empire, and also has NPC systems that you can stage out of. So invaders can go to a system like 319 or PR TAC and live in there and stage an offensive campaign without holding any SOV. You can't kick people out. There's really nothing you can do apart from hoarding all of the NPC offices, but there's always going to be someone that has an office for rent that they can kind of horse trade with another group. So that's why Delve is this hotbed of action. It's a combination of a lot of things that happen. Mm-hmm. But in this time between around 2012 2013, PL are fighting in there. They invite some SIGs from Test Alliance to come down. They call themselves Zulu Squad, I believe. So Zulu Squad starts having quite a lot of fun.
Who were those guys? Because they were really good, unexpectedly.
They were just groups that were in Test Alliance. They had their own little SIGs, and Zulu came out, started taking some areas, and said, "Hey, guys, this is what EVE Online is all about." And so with PL at leading the fleets, and coming up with a lot of the strategy, and Test Alliance providing the bulk of the membership, it's like a match made in heaven between these two groups. Because Test Alliance was very inexperienced in terms of FCs. PL had a limitation on how many people they could bring, so they were often getting blobbed by Nulli, Cascade, and AAA when they would come down. So that it's just a match made in heaven. And during the summer, Test Alliance just makes a lot of pushes and eventually takes all of Delve and Quirius and period basis.
Yeah, so sad.
So they just roll through the region, and Tess is now feeling pretty high on the swagger. They're getting more and more members in their alliance. Their FCs are getting a lot of experience. They're coming up with doctrines that they love. They're flying Rokes. There's can't stop the Roke memes. All of these, cultural things come out of Test Alliance, and this is really where they start booming.
For those that confused, Roke is a battleship, Caldari battleship. It's not Rorqual.
The other thing that happened back during that time, Elise, and I just remember it because it's the first time I met you, but was the Russian Civil War happened and kind of broke apart that entire Russian behemoth out there as, I don't know, Solar accused Legion of something, and the next thing you know, they're going to war with one another, and then Legion basically Legion of Exdeath basically hires Pandemic Legion to come in on their side. And that's where I met you, because I basically, the UAX Death had me go, and I was a renter at the time. UAX Death had me go, and he's like, we need to buy isotopes for them. I go, okay. And he goes, I need you to go get isotopes for them. It's like, so I had to do 40 freaking round trips to Empire to buy isotopes to come down and fuel. And it was the first time I ever saw a super capital fleet like that. And I'm just somewhere on my computer, I still have an image of it from that day, but it was, it was pretty wild to see that, because I was just, this fucking nobody. But,
so yeah, what you're talking about it's incredibly important too. And this is where, the relationship between Test and PL sours for the first time. It wouldn't be the last time that this sours. They become friends again. But after Test, with the help of PL and some other people, after they take over Delft, there's a guy from Legion of Exdeath, a director, that steals, using an alt, allegedly steals trillions of ISK worth of stuff from Solar Fleet, and then takes refuge in a Legion of Exdeath corp. And then MacTep of Solar Fleet goes over to UAX Death, and he says, hey, this guy screwed me over. Can you kick him out? Or at least give me my stuff back? And Exdeath goes, nah. Just how about nah? And then Solar Fleet goes, oh, that's interesting. Okay, you're going to die now. And so the makeup of the DRF at the time was Solar Fleet were very much the muscle, and Legion of Exdeath were very much the industry behind it and the manpower. So when the military turns on the industry, you can probably guess how that goes. And Solar Fleet just wipes the floor with Exdeath. Exdeath approaches PL because he has this great relationship with us. He gave PL our first big contracts, made us gajillions worth of money by giving us money, moons, and venal. And he says, hey, could use a hand up here. So we leave Test and Delft, say, okay, this was fun. Good luck doing whatever you're doing. We're going over to Drone Lands, and we brawl for what feels like battleship brawls every day, where each side's losing hundreds of battleships. And we go and fight, and eventually end up with a lot of space in Drone Lands. And so we're like, shit, what are we going to do with all this space in drones? At the time, Northern Coalition and Evoke have been kicked out of the North that they had before, and the CFC has grown massive. They've taken over Geminate, Vale, Tribute, all the areas where there was this vacuum before. The CFC and Goonswarm have filled it completely. And so Pandemic Legion and Northern Coalition they say, hey, there's this drone land space that we just kind of accidentally found ourselves in.
Well, hold on a second.
Access don't want everything.
Hold on a second. You hadn't actually found yourself there yet, because at the end of the Russian Civil War, Solar Fleet had won and had basically laid claim to the majority of drone land space out there. And there were a bunch of fragmented nobody alliances that came in there. And then shortly thereafter, we began to be visited by people like Pandemic Legion and NC Dot for what we thought was just some incursions at first, okay? But then basically it eventually, they were trying to tease out the fights as best they could and things like that. Okay, this is also when Elo Knight was hired in by Solar to kind of take a I don't know, Green Beret kind of thing of the indigenous peoples that were living there.
Elo and the Myrmidons, right?
Well, that were on the English speaking side, that had kind of repopulated Ethereum Reach, Malpais, Kalevala Expanse, all right, under the auspices of MacTep and Solar Fleet, right? And then NC Dot and PL came in there and they began hitting stuff, and they were trying to tease out the fights and all that. And I think they got as many fights as they probably were going to before some of us realized, whoa, I'm just getting farmed. And then they ended up taking over the area that then eventually became their new rental empire.
By the way, I say Elo and the Myrmidons because I'm comparing him to Achilles, not Myrmidon the ship, but Achilles in his neck, basically.
So when we accidentally that area of space, as Dirk mentioned, we have just these swaths of space, and we're like, what are we going to do with this? And so we decided to, like, renters start poking us. They say, okay, well, I guess you guys are the new landlords now. Who do we pay a rent to? And we're like, I guess us. So create a rental empire to passively make some gold, and we call the alliance Brothers of Tongra, which stands for the acronym obviously is BOT. But the reason we chose that name, I chose it because I got to make decisions like that back then, is in our history, PL had a group called Sons of Tangra that we worked with a lot. So I thought it'd be a fun play on history and stuff like that. But I have to be right back, so hopefully you guys can keep going through the decade. But yeah, this is a hugely important thing because this is when rental empires start becoming a thing, and Test Alliance starts getting too big for their britches, and things begin to happen there, which I'm sure.
Well, the rental empires had already become a thing, but they were generally only under the Russians, right? This, as far as I can recall, was the first time that a non-Russian group, especially over in the East, had sat there and said, well, we're going to have a large rental empire. And that made others out there have to begin to consider that kind of stuff as well. But it was something that was a significant funding mechanism for those alliances, just given, again, the Dominion sovereignty system and the way that worked at the time.
At least how much money was being made by rental?
I think he had to walk off.
Oh, did he? Oh, he stayed here.
Lady Scarlet may be out there to maybe she's listening.
She wasn't running. I mean, the rental thing was just, I think, starting out for PL. N3 wasn't invented yet, so that she ran that after it fell apart. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but
yeah, I mean, following the Russian Civil War,
yeah,
right? What was it? I gave the rise of the Honey Badger Coalition, okay, and their battle against the Southern Coalition down there. And again, that was another. I think the CFC were also involved in that, and there was the whole AAA will never die thing. And
yes, so AAA is. Remember, AAA had these pets like Noli Segunda and other groups, and they were the main influence there. They had gotten mad at CVA and actually knocked them out of Providence, and that was the first time that had happened ever. And I think Northern Coalition actually came back with Evoke, and they lived in Providence for a while before they took off. But AAA was kind of the powerhouse in the South, and they, I believe, get into a fight with Test, and Test aided by other groups, and that was called the Honey Badgers.
I think this. And I'm trying to remember exactly when. It may have been a little bit before this or whatever, but the whole OTEC.
Oh yes, so OTEC
Cabal thing kind of came about at that somewhere around that time, maybe a little bit before.
Yeah, so for Noli Segunda, because that's where I was, they get kicked out of Thunderdome because Test comes down and just kind of wipes out the place and takes it over. And now they have a couple of regions and they're feeling pretty good. So what happens to Noli Segunda? They go up to the Vale area, Is it Vale? Yeah. And they hook up with NC Dot, and they also hook up with Elo Knight. I mean, first they go to faction war. Like everybody would, once you get kicked out of nullsec, it's terrible that, you have to move all your stuff. And everybody says, what do we do now? And one of the major recovery areas was faction war. People would go to faction war to hang out for a while to kind of keep their guys going while they figured out what to do next.
We're going to regroup in low-sec.
Yeah, regroup in low-sec, do some faction war, and then go back and figure out where we want to go back into nullsec. So Dot Bros is formed from that. You have NC Dot up there. They own some moons. You have Dot Bros up there. Elo Knight and Black Legion is up there, and then you have Nelly Segunda up there. So what's happening is you did have OTEC that had just come to an end. And OTEC was basically an agreement among, I think it was 5 parties. I should know this. One of them is Test. One of them is CFC or Goon Swarm. One of them is Pandemic Legion. One of them is...
Yeah, PL was involved there.
And the last group is Evoke, actually, which is a much smaller German group, but they got a piece of that pie for some reason. It could be the remnants of kicking out Northern Coalition in the north. So those groups there have moons, and they say, hey, look, there's a bottleneck on this mineral called technetium. Let's regulate it. We'll all make money, and everything will go through us. And so they do. So the first, and an interesting thing happens around this time. This PL fighter named Ravy, who's really good, and he does alliance tournaments, ends up being hired by CCP. And that guy turns out to be CCP Fozzie. And the first thing he does when he gets into CCP is he targets OTEC and breaks it up by creating alchemy.
Yeah, and you know what? Again, this is almost one of those times where you got to look back at sort of the economy of Eve, and just comment about, sometimes these things lead to conflict. Other times they lead to this other thing of diplomacy, right? And that was really where kind of OTEC came out of, right? Why are we continuing to fight each other over these money moons, and waste all that income on fighting over them? And they, created sort of OTEC to be this, way of sort of splitting it up in such a way. But it was the fact that you had a bottleneck, a significant bottleneck that meant something, that created a lot of conflict, especially at a time when, what you were fighting over, were pauses and kind of the enjoyment of fighting over moons like that.
Right. So OTEC has been dismantled by CCP, particularly Fozzie, who figured out that you need a release valve so you could take other minerals, put them together, and create technetium out of nothing. Well, not out of nothing, but out of other minerals that you don't have access to. And that goes around the bottleneck. So even if they choke on, they have a chokehold on that mineral, let's call it mineral, technetium, people could create their own technetium or technetium, however you want to call it, and build the T2 stuff that you need to build. So that's what kind of dismantled that. But also there's an attitude from NC Dots like, we got too much money. We don't need any more money. Let's fight. We need fights is what we need. So instead, what they do is they, with Elo Knight, attack the CFC moons in Venal, and there's a big brawl. The treaty is over for those guys, and Elo Knight and Vince Draken form Dot Bros with Gorga and Pro God Legend at that time too. So what happens though is that Nully fighters are really just kind of fighters. Like Pro God steps aside, Elo runs the fleets, and Vince runs like the bigger missions with capitals and super capitals. Now you should have to understand who Vince Draken is at this point, right? He's a veteran of many wars, and he's an incredibly good and aggressive FC, and he's loved by his followers because doesn't matter how many guys he has, he will drive right into a group that's twice its size and he'll scare them into their station and just camp them. He really lived to impose power on people, and that's the identity of NC Dot comes from his personality of imposing power. So Dot Bros is up there kicking around, and they're fighting Goon Swarm, and Goon Swarm is stumbling because they always do when they start a war. They stumble and make errors, and then they look at their errors and they correct for those errors, and then they are consistent enough to start winning, and they bring enough manpower to bear to make that happen. But initially, when you start fighting Goon Swarm, they take huge losses trying to figure out what's going on. But an odd thing happens in the middle of Dot Bros versus CFC. Vince Draken opens a second front against Solar. And I don't know if Vince, an Englishman, just doesn't like Russians, because he said a lot of anti-Russian stuff at the time. But he wanted to fight Solar at the same time. So you have a two-front war, and Dot Bros is stuck in the middle of that. And it starts. We see that Dot Bros starts burning out, and what follows next is something of legend here. But there's a disagreement between Elo Knight, who has started to, I don't know what the word is on internet, date, or has a relationship with NC's number 2 female, not Lady Scarlet. It was Wicked Princess, I believe. And Wicked Princess,
because of Falcon,
right? And there's a ship, a Falcon, that is in a hangar, and it's taken by Wicked Princess, I believe. And Vince says, "Where's that ship? That ship was not your ship. That ship was my ship." And she's like, "No, that was my ship." And there's a disagreement over a Falcon. So if you hear about legend of Dot Bros and the Falcon, that's what they're fighting over, a ship. And she and Vince break off relations, and she takes off and goes over to Elo Knight as a refugee, of course, and he takes her in. And so now you have Elo Knight versus Vince Draken. Elo's not going to fly anymore for Dot Bros. They break up, and so off goes Elo Knight, and that's the end of Dot Bros as you knew it initially. And now you just have Nelly Segunda and NC Dot, which is important because that relationship will form N3, which is basically what happens because the CFC is too powerful. They start coming in and throwing NC and Nelly Segunda out. Elo Knight is now the third front in that war, and Solar Fleet. So NC Dot can't fight Solar, Elo, or Black Legion, and CFC, and they go. Gorga says, "Let's do something in the south. We'll put all these groups together down there and create N3." So you had N for NC, N for Nelly Segunda, N for Nexus Fleet. And Nexus Fleet was basically like a newbie fleet where you could kind of come into the place. And those were the 3 alliances that started it. But Gorga, who was kind of the organizational leader of this group, came out and said, "We're not going to do a major alliance plus pets relationship. We think it's unfair. Everybody's equal. Everybody's going to have say-so. We're going to build a council, and we're going to do this right." And so that's when you start seeing the formation of N3, which ends up becoming a very big player in the South.
Now, Elise had mentioned Montolio earlier, and now I think is when things sort of come back in, right? Because after the Honey Badger coalition down there and the Southern Coalition War that went on and whatnot, I think there was a little bit of a period there, but not much. I mean, you're still talking about kind of this 2012 into 2013 sort of time frame, right? And then we have a realignment of the moons in EVE Online.
A redistribution, right?
A redistribution across the board of moons in EVE Online, people going madhouse, mapping moons out there. And this place called Fountain turns up to apparently have a nice selection, of moons that I believe Test at the time was sitting on. And I'm going to try and remember, is Elise back?
No, he'll be back.
Okay, yeah, he's not back yet. All right, I'm going to try and remember what it was at the time, or what at least what the narrative was that was built for sort of the falling out between
I can tell
the
you.
CFC and Tech.
Yeah, it was multiple fronts, but basically they were saying that Montolio is an unstable leader, and you shouldn't follow him, Test. And if you Test guys, we don't want to fight you guys. We like Test. We helped raise you, but your leader is too erratic. And this is when you have something of a cultural war. A cultural shift inside of Goon Swarm from a ragtag group of malcontents that basically just want to ruin the game for everybody. They start changing over to like, okay, let's grow up a little bit. Let's take this racism, put that aside. Let's take this, clean up some social aspects to it. Let's not treat people bad. That sort of stuff.
The Cultural Revolution is it.
So the Cultural Revolution happens, and Test is like looking at that, scoffing, or Montolio is saying like, hell no, we're Test. We make noise. Everything is we're irreverent to everything, and so that was one aspect of the divide, the wedge between those two groups. But you also had, you're right, a financial interest in Fountain, which Test was sitting on. Test was actually a lot of people, but not very good. That's what they were known for. They were great with PL because PL would come in and they would be the precision punch. But then you had all these people in Test that would be the meat shield to protect that fist. And so Test on its own was not very strong, but with a different group, they could be stronger because they had a lot of people.
Yeah. I'd say they were like the ground troops, right? I mean, they were. And you know what? A lot of alliances out there, kind of held that position. People might refer to them as meat shields or whatever, but really what it is these are the raw numbers of subcap pilots that were also backed by the fist of, something larger and maybe, more strategically organized.
Mm-hmm. From what I hear, though, there was a dislike of Montolio, not just they really thought he was ill-equipped to be leader. I think you hear Boat talk about how Montolio was just a very strange and caustic fellow, and it could be true. But they didn't want anything to do with Montolio, so I think what happened is, was it the Honey? I'm trying to think of when Honey Badgers actually formed, because you had PL working with Test.
They had formed before that. They were up against AAA and all that, weren't they?
Yes, the Southern War had.
That Southern War was. Yeah.
So this is after the Southern War. AAA's vanquished. Honey Badgers is now a thing that Test is a part of, but there's a point where Sword Dragon actually leaves. Because one of the things that happened, there's a point where Sword Dragon leaves to kind of lead Honey Badgers as a coalition. There were a few other groups in there, but Test was the major one. And that's where I need some clarity. Maybe we can get that a little bit later when Elise comes back. But yes.
But basically, you have this thing that became known as the Fountain War kickoff down there, right? The CFC, up in the Northwest there in the North, went on down and began to have some serious slugfests in the J5A, area down there, just massive battles on the gates, and actually getting kind of whooped at first, as I recall. We had a few bad outings there on, trying to break through, into Fountain to be able to stage some stuff. Lost a station and.
Well, again, the Imperium or Goonswarm doesn't do well at the beginning of fights, but they end up changing their game and adapting, and then being able to win with the numbers they can bring.
But I mean, this was a war that went on through much of I don't know what, like the first half of 2013.
Yeah, 2013. Yeah. Well, it was really a summer war. I think it started in the spring.
No, it started earlier. It started earlier than that because there was some time between that and then the Halloween War, which ends up kicking off after it.
The Halloween War starts, of course, in Halloween of 2013, and this was the summer war that led up to. You're right. There was 2 months of quiet, maybe. So this is the spring, summer of 2013. God, all this, and we're just talking about 2013, but it'll go faster.
Yeah, I mean that's just it. Is that you had this thing, the Fountain War, right? You had some pretty significant battles, and and again these were not my recollection. These were the kind of battles that went system by system. Basically, you were pushing front lines back. Okay, granted, you may have skirmishes and activity and setting of all this stuff, right, as a part of Dominion sovereignty. Setting of battles here and timers there and all that kind of stuff, right. But generally speaking, there was a lot of kind of pushing the front lines back, and I know that there was also a thing where somehow the CFC side, had gained some stations or strategic points by way of I don't know, some shit getting turned over, and now I'm not going to remember that exactly, but this, I mean, it was a good size war where you had not yet seen kind of massive super capital type battles and things like that.
Yeah, so what you have in Fountain War is a mixture of things, right? This was a lot of stuff. First of all, you have Goon Swarm kind of maturing as a capital group. Before this, they were mostly subcapitals, but now they're starting to get they're using capitals a lot more often, and they're starting to get into using super capitals in a bigger way. This is a big change because if you think about Goon Swarm's inception in 2006, they were basically rifters. We're going to get in our rifters and we're going to clog your cannons with our bodies, and their whole thing was to throw men at a group, because these guys didn't have a lot of skills and didn't have a huge amount of wealth, but they had a lot of people, and they attracted people who were from Something Awful, which was kind of a very playful place. Very, there's a lot of like lunatics coming, right? So you throw a lot of people at a thing, but over time, those rifters changed into battleships. And in Fountain War, they're mostly in battleships, but they're also, the advanced guys are in carriers and some dreadnoughts. And even more advanced guys are starting to get into super capitals because they've sat on a lot of wealth, technetium, property in the north, money moons. And so they have started to build super capitals that you will see later in the Halloween War and BTAC-R.
I mean, the big thing I remember being involved in very heavily during the Fountain War were what we called the siege fleets, where we were out there in just massive numbers of bombers and black ops just flittering around all over the place. And if somebody came to respond, boom, we'd blink out of there, or we'd cloak up or whatever. It was very hard to defend against, when what we were doing was we were taking down the pauses, right? We were just ripping down the pauses out there, for that. Yeah, main battle fleets were about main battles over things like stations and iHubs and things like that. But every single night there were multiple siege fleets, the bomberless bombers, of the back then, going out to do this, and a lot of skirmish commanders out there and whatnot were flying these just 24/7.
Yes, this what I recall about, and I was in it on Noli Segunda PL side, was that there was a lot of there was a lot of rolling in, rolling out. So in the U.S., Goon Swarm would kind of get the upper hand, and then night would come, and PL and Nelly Segunda would do Australian time zone ops and roll stuff back, and it was going back and forth quite a bit. But then there was a political change that happened, and Sword Dragon was, I believe, I remember now. The reason Honey Badgers gets complicated is Sword Dragon was in charge of Honey Badgers, right? And Sword Dragon goes to FanFest, and there he meets Pro God Legend, and there is some kind of a skirmish over. It gets into real life, so I won't get into that, but they do not like each other. And so Sword Dragon announces live at FanFest, when he's being interviewed by CCP, in the in-between things, that he's going to go to war. He's going to take Honey Badgers to war against Nelly Segunda because he's mad at them. And Honey Badgers is basically Test at this point, says, no, we're not gonna do that. And so Honey Badgers breaks up. So Sword Dragon is upset about this, and he still owns a couple constellations in the north of Fountain. So he gives all those constellations to Goon Swarm, and those flip instantly. It wasn't a big change, but it was a significant hit, and it was an interesting what you could call a backstab if you're from Fountain, or an interesting diplomatic move if you're a third party looking at that. So that was one thing. But one of the thing about Fountain War, and the reason people refer to it a lot, even though it's early in the decade, is that a lot of things were changing at the time, and that war was fun as hell because there were so many fleets to participate in, so many people fighting, and the tides were going back and forth, and it just seemed like it had everything. It had espionage, it had diplomatics, it had a lot of sub-cap fights, and then you had a major capital fight that actually, I think the server got turned off in front of. I think.
Yeah, I was in there.
Yeah, I forget, was that J5 or JA, or was it? It was a key system that was being fought over. It was one of the gates into Fountain, and there was a capital fight. The power went out, and everybody got disconnected. And Goon Swarm was really mad because they were beating Pandemic Legion's capital fleet. So they thought, this was unfair. I believe this is also the beginning of slow cats and the doctrines of capital ships, carriers, and dreads or whatever that repair each other, creating essentially a invulnerable mass of capital ships.
I don't know. I don't know if that had hit yet, or if that was more either, because I don't remember that being a major thing in kind of the last big battle or anything like that. What was that? Whatever tests, like, last standing capital system was, or whatever. I mean, you did have these things, but it wasn't like what we saw in the Halloween War, right? Which became a lot of stuff against.
But this is when it was starting, not when it got perfected and used.
Yes.
And Wrecking Ball came in the Halloween War, but initially slow cats were starting to catch on. Those were pioneered by Manfred Sidious, who was in charge of Pandemic Legion at the time.
6 VDT. Thanks, Rob.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. The early stages of it, you are correct. But I don't think that we had yet experienced, kind of the other things like waterboarding and things like that. That kind of came up later on.
That was later on. The system where we had the capital battle, which got disconnected, was E9PP, which is on the road down from Cloud Ring as such. But the 6 VDT fight was their final stand. That was correct, Doug.
Well, we haven't gotten quite there yet, but but you're right. There were things that were developing here, and Fountain War was the first war that felt legitimately powerful. Like, it was a big event because you had North. First of all, and this was a big deal because things were getting kind of stale with OTEC working. People really wanted TEST to turn on their master CFC, and this actually had happened. And then you had people piling on because they wanted to fight the Goon Swarm. So you had Nully in there, you had NC. in there, and you had PL in there. And those three groups were getting together, and that was a powerful combination along with TEST. So there was a lot of optimism that Imperium, or I keep calling it Imperium, but Goon Swarm could be defeated by this group, right? And they were fighting in Fountain. So this was politically, it was a big war. Militarily, it was a big war. And you see a lot of new ideas starting to emerge from this. But as it turns out, something happens that totally unplugs this war. And that is someone from Snuff, basically, before they're Snuff. They're part of Elna, a corporation in Nulli Segunda. And what they do is they basically dissolve the training group for N3, which is, again, the combination of NC. and Nulli Segunda and many more alliances now, many more alliances now. And so they unplug the training group for them, and they unplug the rental group for Nulli Segunda. And so at that point, there's a huge, because you have 2 or 3 whole regions completely go solveless in the south. And what happens is Manfred Sidious basically with, I think, Vince and ProGod all say, we're taking a timeout. We got to go and recapture that Sov. And they go down there and they recapture the Sov in an astounding, at least the stations, they recapture the stations in 48 hours. Really fast, but then they need to capture all the places. That takes a while too. But what happened there was that TEST was actually, at this point during the Fountain War, being led by ProGod from Nulli, who was helping them with their fleets. He was doing a lot of fleets for them. So he stuck around up there, or he was basically leading TEST. So he had to take off. So you have basically the really powerful military have to take off, and at that point leaving TEST alone without good leadership and without really any pilots. And those guys get run over by Goon Swarm, and they get backed into a final battle. And this is one of the biggest battles in EVE Online's history, because all these TEST guys basically say, come on, it's going to be fun, it's our last stand, let's go and die together in this station fight. And So it was not a contested battle. The war was already swinging strongly in a direction in favor of CFC. So it was not an important battle, only that it was a huge battle and a fun battle for people who wanted to be in it.
I think it's important also to point out that earlier in January 2013, we totally forgot about this, the Battle of Assakai.
Right. So Battle of Assakai is important because
it was actually before the Fountain War, but I totally forgot it was in January of 2013. But
it was. You have three battles that are very important, and they all happen in January. First of all, you have Assakai that happens in January 2012.
13.
Was it 13?
I believe it's 13.
Yes, it might be. Okay. Right. So you have Assakai happens in January, and it's a faction war area, and Boat, I think, was in a certain area. So you have the CFC kind of making itself, they're playing with faction war people or something. They're just kind of fighting. And Boat accidentally jumps in a Titan, which makes him a big target. And so PL is called, and so PL and these other groups all jump in and they try to destroy Boat. And it's low sec, so everything slows down because you have this new thing called tie-dye. It's brand new. People don't know how to use it yet. They don't know what actually happens. And so you have plenty of time for other people to get into this fight, and the server is not going to break. So it's worth getting there. And that's the logic of it. And that's why so many people pile into this one battle, Assakai, which is just a low sec area, not strategically important. The undercurrent to all this is that PL really wants to fight Goon Swarm, but they don't, and they can technically fight them, but they've been allies this whole time. So it's kind of they need a good excuse to beat up on.
Well, I don't know that I'd call it allies. I don't know that they were allies at the time, but I believe that they were part of.
Not official allies, but they had been allies before. But this is them wanting to turn on them. So that's what some of the motivation was underneath it. But you have tie-dye, which allows people to get into this fight, and this huge fight happens, and it's reported all over the world that this big battle happened in EVE Online, and the servers didn't crash. And so you have a huge amount of people that are now interested in these big battles come to EVE Online, and that's where you see test grow, because a lot of them are coming from Reddit. Why? Because this battle is posted in, I think, r/video games, which has millions of people watching that. And so when they see this huge battle, a lot of Redditors come to the game. Not necessarily people from other areas, but it's Redditors come to EVE Online and they join the group that's already there, Test. And you see Test grow into a powerhouse. And that growth leads to dominance of Fountain and Delve and makes them a target because they're very inexperienced. They just want to be in big fights. And they're sitting on territory that Goon Swarm wants.
I mean, it is kind of funny because of how much attention that single battle that just sort of happened out of nowhere, kind of did, right? But when you look at the numbers of what was lost, right, on the Honey Badger Coalition side, 1 super, 11 carriers, and 6 dreads. And on the CFC side, 3 Titans, 5 supers, 29 carriers, and 44 dreads, right? There were actually larger fights. I think that it happened in that DRF versus Northern Coalition as far as supers and things like that were involved. But this one, because of 3 Titans dead, and stuff like that, got a lot of attention. And also because it was sort of out of nowhere, right? Like it wasn't just like the culmination of some war where this happened.
No, it was an accident fluke. It got a lot of attention. People join Test. Test becomes big. Fountain War then happens between CFC and basically Test. Test aided by N3 groups at the time. And so that's where we're at. Test finally falls in what was it? 6VDT? Yeah.
6VDT.
That's right. Yeah, they have a big final battle, but the war is already over and they're destroyed. Now, something is happening in the south at this time, right? Because you had this giant unplugging of N3, and you have some territory. I believe, and I really would like Elise's memory on this. You have Russians kind of contesting because Russians are mad at Vince, right? Because Northern Coalition, because of the war that happened up there in the north. But Solar Fleet is now in the south, taking up space, I believe, in N3 area. So what Pro God Legend and Vince and even PL are doing is they're coming back and fighting Russians, and that is what you see the beginnings of the Halloween War, which is really only 2 months after the Fountain War actually ended. So what's happening again is you have the Halloween War is focused on the South, mostly in Amencia and Fate and those areas. And you have a CFC that is like claiming victory and partying and drinking wine because they just won a big war. And now they have Fountain. And they're like, hey, our Russian friends are in trouble down in the South. Maybe we can go and just kind of, put some pressure on these guys that just fought us in the Fountain War. And that all happens, I guess it starts in Halloween, where you start seeing alliances formed like the CFC helping the Russians take on N3 and PL. Okay, and I think we all fought in the Halloween War, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so initially, PL is kicking the crap out of CFC or Goonswarm in Catch. They're just owning them. I think the doctrines had shifted. Right now, at this point, you see the Slow Cats are a staple for and unbeatable, right? Because when you have NC and PL put together their capital fleet, those guys can repair each other all day long and never be destroyed. So it's just like it's unbreakable. And then you have what's called the drone assist that was unlimited. So and this is the powerhouse of Slow Cats, is you have all these carriers that cannot be destroyed because they're repairing each other.
Yeah.
And they deploy their drones, and they have unlimited bays for drones, essentially. So you can have wave after wave after wave after wave of drones. So they cannot be defanged. Their power can't be defanged. And you can assign all those drones to one person's command. And that one person command can point at somebody, and it's all the drones fire on that person and immediately blow it up, regardless of what it is.
Yeah, just evaporate somebody, like regardless of what they were in, pretty much.
So what you have is a Death Star, right? Slow Cats formed a Death Star, and it had a planet-killing weapon, and so it just was blapping and blapping and blapping right through Drake fleets, right through Baltec fleets, whatever was coming at them, they're just able to destroy it. So once the Slow Cats came onto the field, the match was over, and it was not beatable.
Except for the fact that it was somewhat immobile. However, when you're talking about going up against things like structures, right, as part of the sovereignty warfare system, things like that, right, when you're going up against an iHub, when you're going up against a station, all right, like this thing can just sit on top of it and just pour damage down onto it without really being too badly affected by whatever the defense fleet was out there.
Right.
Because it wasn't like anybody was throwing up a counter, of a Titan fleet against it or anything.
Yeah, it could deal with pretty much anything except for a massive super capital kind of force.
So Slow Cats are a thing, and then there's what you do against Slow Cats is you basically slow them down, called waterboarding. So if you've heard of that, and this is basically you just basically make them stay out on the field as forever, and people get really tired and resentful, and so they don't want to show up on those. So it's like torturing people who get into those fleets because they can't move. And they can't log off because otherwise you'll lose that asset out there, right? If you leave that asset, it'll be lost. So that's what happens.
Well,
as Robert's saying out there is it had two issues: range and mobility, right? I mean, it's not like its range was unlimited, because again, they were using sentry drones basically. And then once they were in place, if you could lock them down, you could keep them there for hours and hours.
Okay, so that it morphs into an even bigger version of it, which is called the Wrecking Ball. And it's more of I don't know how effective it was, but the Wrecking Ball comes around, and that's Slow Cats with a hollow center. And one of the ways that
this is a creation of Manfred Sidious as well. Like he took the idea of Slow Cats and created what was considered to be called the Wrecking Ball, right?
Yes, it's a advance in that line of thinking. And so in the middle of this ball, this circle of carriers, you put in super carriers, and they can't bounce out of there. They would bounce around in there like a little nuclear fusion, and that would keep them from flying off. Because what happens when you bring a lot of super carriers in, is they bounce off each other, and if they bounce off each other, one will fly off to the side and get too far away from its group, and those are the ones that you pick off. So that's what that was a reaction to. And essentially, you have in Head GP a huge battle between the CFC, who's now committed a lot more troops, a lot more dreadnoughts, and I think they lose something like 400 dreadnoughts inside of Head GP because I believe it wasn't tie-dye. The problem there was the game did crash eventually, and so when CFC was logging back in, they were getting picked off by PL and NC. And so they lost like 400 dreads. Huge loss. A few days later, the Battle of BTAC-R. And there's a lot to the Battle of BTAC-R, but we're going to skip a lot of it just to be a little better on time.
Well,
the result,
the one thing I do want to point out is that there were a lot of capitals and super capitals that are down there at this point. Right. prior to Head, right? That the CFC does have, right, and like they weren't really known to be a coalition that was throwing its potential weight out there in terms of that, right? PL, NC, those guys, they were the ones that were really known for, we will field these things at a moment's notice, where that hadn't happened yet. But then the plan was, right, to go in on Head GP, and then that went wrong.
Yeah, the thinking was that CFC is feeling pretty strong now, right? They've just won a war. Now they're in the south, and they have this huge armada because they've got some wealth and they've been building it, but they're new to it. And PL and NC are like, this is great. We have newbies in big, expensive ships. We're going to take a huge bite out of them. And for a while, inside the Halloween War, you have these groups, and you have Russians down there too, right? That's who's being fought by N3, circling each other around the ring, like ready to go. They're ready to, like, at some point, it's all going to go down, and we're going to take out a lot of these super capitals that CFC have built. And that's what they want. They want to have this fight. So they're baiting and trying to get each other to engage. Head GP looks like it's going to happen, but the system breaks down. And when the systems comes back up, basically the CFC lost that one really bad. And it was mostly CFC because the Russians, I think, didn't help them at all. If I'm not mistaken, they did not jump into that.
I just remember jumping in, not being able to do anything. Everything was going to hell in a handbasket. Getting the order to jumped out. Finally got to my destination system. Made a move and then exploded. It was like I died in the other system.
Yeah, it's crazy. So only a few days later, this accident happens where SOV drops on a system called BTAC-R. It was actually my home at the time. I was living in there mining. And it happens right at uptime, right after downtime. And SOV drops, whether it was paid or it was a bug, who knows. And at this point, PL, that's their home base. That's where they're staging out of. That's not where NC was staging out of, or Nully. They were staging out of different areas, but all like near that area. And PL was actually, they had run up to do an errand with their supers, and so they were out of position. So when BTAC-R happens, it's an accident. Razor finds that SOV is dropped, so Razor starts claiming the SOV.
It's funny. I was in that initial kind of fleet that was there. So basically, we went in there. For whatever particular reason, we'd formed like a Dominic's fleets to go in, and someone, I think there was someone on the some of our scouts basically said like, oh guys, the territory claimed kind of unit is like, there's no territory claimed in BTAC-R, and people just like freaked out, like seriously. And then I think it dawned on them that like, because the way that Dominion SOV works, if you don't have sovereignty in the system, you don't have any other timers relating to reinforcing a station. So you can just fire straight through the station and claim it. And we knew at that particular point that PL had all of their stuff in that station. So it was a case of like, we hightailed it there to basically put damage on that station and flip it as fast as we could. And I believe the FCs of Razor basically got on the horn with anybody that we knew at that time that could help. And at that particular point, it was like most of the Russian bloc. So they came in and they helped.
Because the Russians are awake at this time, right? So this is pre U.S. time zone, which is when CFC is strong. So I want to make this quick, but basically Russians jump in with super capitals. This is an opportunity now for NC and PL to take out Russian super capitals. Russians, I believe Sword Dragon was kind of with them at this time, and he's the one that says that he contacted the CFC commander. What's his name?
Lazarus the Butcher Raven.
Kept wanting to say Lux, but it was Laz, yeah. And Laz, after losing a bunch of guys in head GP, has no hesitations and jumps in anyway to BTAC R, and it was a good move.
And I'm sorry, my attention was elsewhere. Did you mention the fact of how Manfred had gone north to deal with something?
He had to deal with something
sometime in the north, so they weren't there.
Right, they were out of position.
Yeah, they were out of position. They had to deal with something, and then they were coming back, and Manfred was just like, Manfred was already kind of, I believe he was already quite tired from having to deal with like fleets prior to all of that. So he was just he basically came in. Did the usual kind of thing, formed up enough people to get the wrecking ball kind of rolling, and then use that as basically, the idea was to drop it as an apex force in order to essentially scare away any kind of CFC, dreams of taking anything.
Okay, so the big point here is that BTAC-R is the collision of a new strong CFC with their supers, a collision of Russians that are their allies with the old powers that had these ships to begin with, NCPL, and you have Nelly Segunda helping them out. And there's a lot to this battle. Suffice to say, it's a huge battle, 21 hours long. And everybody discovers that the only thing that happens in these tie-dye fights that's important is those doomsdays, right? So you have to have enough Titans to really win the day. And it was an exchange going back and forth and back and forth. And they took a little bit of a long time on Sword Dragon because he was super tanked. And in that time, they tried to kill him. They might have lost 3 Titans, and it starts to go back and forth. And at a certain point, there's just they're too far behind. And by the end of the day, you have like 70 Titans being destroyed. Most of those happened after the battle was already over and people were just unable to extract.
Yeah, there were a lot of things going on in the sidelines because there were CFC members who lost Titans outside of the battle, getting engaged trying to get to the battle. I know personally one of our Titans that had to leave almost got ambushed exiting. He actually got in the strangest way possible. He even got heat damage on his rigs in some way, shape, or form, and I have no idea how that happens.
Crazy programming, yeah.
But anyway, it was insane.
We got to move on because I'm running out of time. But BTAC-R happens. Now, why is BTAC-R such a big deal? What are the lessons learned from BTAC-R? Well, one is it was a huge, instead of PL taking a big bite out of Goon Swarm and Russians took a big bite out of PL, because actually mostly PL died in that battle, not NC, which actually frustrated Matani, who wanted to see NC dot go down, not PL. They didn't necessarily dislike PL. Mittens was not for this battle, according to Laz. I remember Laz made a presentation and he said Mittens did not want to go into this battle. Laz was the deciding factor there. So he's the one that took CFC in. They win the battle, but Grath talks to Matati saying, "Can I get my guys out? We're out of this war. We're going to unplug and take off."
Well, because basically PL had all their shit there. I mean, it was all now locked in this station. As far as all of their subcap or just capital related stuff, like it was a whole bunch of their stuff just locked in now.
Right.
And I'll call it, they basically sued for
well, they asked, and Matani said, yeah, okay. And there was a couple of reasons for that. One is like when you kill someone completely like that and take all their stuff they've earned over a period of many years. Remember, Titans at this point are worth $100 billion, right? It's not your $40 billion. And it's hard enough to get sovereignty, to get that stable sovereignty. So it's a whole different ballgame for getting supers than it is now. So it was a big deal to have them. To have that go, you're going to knock a lot of players out of the game. And they probably knew that to some level. But Matani still thinks it's one of the biggest mistakes he ever made was not to kill PL there, because they probably could have. And so PL does get out. They rebuild rather quickly. Within a few months, they're able to pull players who are no longer playing anymore. They take their Titans back, and they anyway. So they kind of rebuild. Kenneth Feld is a big part of that rebuilding process. NC Dot ends up. Well, actually, what happens after the BTAC-R is that CFC wins again, and they go home happy, and they leave. The Russians to kind of fend for themselves, and the Russians actually get espionaged out of sovereignty and implode, and NC Dot and Nelly Segunda kind of wipe out the Russians. No, I'm sorry. One thing happens. NC hides right after BTAC-R, I believe.
The dead zone.
Yes, and then Nelly Segunda.
Zoning of what was it, OTEC 7 or I don't know. I forget what the
W. Yeah, I was in Detroit. That's all I remember.
The 7-day hill camp.
Yeah, after BTAC-R, Nelly Segunda runs to Detroit. That's where they retreat to. They rally there. They tell ProGod they're not going to be chased there. They lied. So CFC hell camps Nelly Segunda, trying to kill it because they don't like Nelly Segunda for personal reasons. I think they said something about Vile Rat or something, and that's something that Matani will never forgive. So he begs CFC guys to fight just one more thing, and that is Nelly Segunda, and they hell camp him into Detroit, hoping to kill them off. It doesn't work, but that was what they were trying to do. And then they go home. Nelly Segunda emerges, and starts to work with NC Dot, and they win the Halloween War by taking out the Russians through, I believe it was espionage, and the Russians implode, and NC Dot and N3 kind of take over the whole territory, and that's when N3 becomes a powerhouse that owns the entire South. CFC goes up north, starts just basically living off the land, and PL is in recovery mode. They fight Russians to an end, and I think they dead zone, or they hell camp them or dead zone them, and Solar basically dies at that point too. So that's kind of a lot of things are coming to an end right around 2014. And then people say SOV is boring, and they put out the SOV deal saying we want more occupancy SOV rather than this hyper traveling everywhere. Because the thing about the Wrecking Ball and thing about
just an FYI, the dead zone of Solar's station over there,
WC3P or something.
That had happened. That had happened earlier. That was the first one.
You're right. That was the first one
to have happened. Right. The other one happened, but then didn't last that long. And
you're right.
Yes, it was great sitting there running 24-hour things where all you did was assign your drones to FCs as they were coming in and out and whatnot.
That was why they could happen that way. A lot of technological changes make the game viable. So anyway, at this point, you have a lull that happens, and people are really unhappy with force projection, that people could move so far so fast, and with tie-dye, it made it worse, and get into battles. And so something had to be done about how fast and far capitals could move. And so you have, for a long time, you have rather quickly a first step that's done by Grayscale called the Phoebe jump changes. And at that point, they say, we're going to restrict dramatically how far and fast you can jump in these capital ships to restrict that power. And the capital changes happen, and people are really kind of testing the waters to figure out how they can live. At this time, you have CFC
in the late summer, early fall. of, I believe it was 2014, you had Grayscale come out and say, we're going to be going down a path of making changes in nullsec. And then the first one that was announced were those jump drive changes, and I believe the introduction of fatigue with Phoebe. That was the first one, and then into 2015, in August or whatever, you had Fuzzy Sov come in, the new Aegis sovereignty system and things like that. And then we continued to build for a number of years, right? In 2015, 2016, obviously you had Citadel and things. So that was the beginning of the changes to nullsec that were coming in order to revitalize it, I guess.
So I think you can look back at the Halloween War, or BTAC-R specifically, as the end of an era. And it was the end of the middle era of EVE Online, which to me was the funnest era for EVE Online, because there was a lot of battleship fleets, a lot of opportunity to do stuff, good movement, right? We talked about that movement thing being important. And after BTAC-R, it feels like a lot of business is settled. A lot of grudges have been settled. And N3 forms, but really they're just kind of renting the heck out of the South. You can see they take over half the map. They try to get into Delft, where CFC has extended their power because they defeated Test in the Fountain War, and they've gone all the way down to Delft now. And so that's where there's some fights.
I think the thing was you were getting a combination of two things that were happening around that time, that because the word stagnation had been used before, but it was beginning to be used more and more and more, right? And I honestly believe that when you go back and look again where we began the decade off and then where we're at this point, you had a number of things that were kind of that brought it together to why you would end up having stagnation. I mean, you had the massive proliferation of capitals and super capitals that were going on out there, the resources that came in with Dominion sovereignty in terms of what IHEBs would allow for in terms of mining and all of that kind of thing. And this is obviously not even what happened later on in the decade that exacerbated it further and really sped it up. Just Dominion sovereignty itself got figured out, but with all of these caps and different things that you could use and the ability to move around so quickly, I think really just caused people to sit there and go, what exactly are we fighting over?
Right. So now you have what you have is now the beginning of the modern age of EVE Online with these jump changes, because that changes the landscape and the strategies in a big way. So these changes come in, and you have a lull because everybody's waiting for the new SOV changes. So nobody wants to do anything big. So for basically a year and a half, 2014, the rest of 2014, because all the Halloween War ended basically in the spring. So you have the summer and then the fall, and then you have the whole next year, like 2015, where people are waiting to see what that SOV is going to look like, so they hold all their investments. They don't try to make any big moves because all those moves may be completely undone by a new SOV.
And to be fair, you had gone through a period of a lot of warfare out there. Yeah. That, like any war in EVE, tends to be the many who are being led by the few, right? And those few, those FCs, those logistical people and things like that, right? They get tired out at the end of campaigns, and a couple of those campaigns were fairly long and fairly strenuous.
Well, you see retirements of people like Manfred Sidious, I think, kind of takes off for a while. And you have Mr. V, I think, also. I don't know how long he sticks around. So there's a lot of people. Billy, I think, takes off after all this stuff happens, or right before it, the Halloween War. So you have some guys that are burned out and taking off, and other people are kind of simmering. So that's what happens in this middle decade, is a lot of simmering, not a lot of movement going on. No major wars, but a lot of skirmishes and testing. So once the Phoebe changes hit, people are trying to test how that works. And you see people make mistakes. You see Black Legion make a decision to try try to run their capitals down to a fight, and they just totally get killed on their way home because it's too slow. You see the CFC running all these capitals to the from deck line down to Delve, and it just takes forever. And so they're realizing, wow, these jump changes are not going to allow us to do what we did before. And people start living more regionally, and the fights become more skirmishy and that sort of thing.
Which was the point, and I think that was the reason why that was the first change to come out, was basically, they were putting a significant barrier to entry to force projection. Right, you may still have the forces, but your ability to put them out there and just whack whoever you want to, and then be home for dinner.
Yeah, and see, the thing was, that was a fun time when you could do that, but it got out of hand. And if you look at the changes, you have the server crashing because too many people are getting into fights. So you do this thing called tie-dye, which makes it worse because now everybody can get into these fights. Everybody who has incentive to get there, because the server won't crash and you have plenty of time to get there. And now you have jump change restrictions to make it slower for you to travel to these fights, so you can't get there in time. But the side effects of that are, now, even if there is no battle, just moving is tough. So you have the rise of these giant move fleets, where everybody needs to move together like a giant herd. And that is pretty spectacular to just see how powerful, at least in NC. You could see that we had hundreds and hundreds of Titans, right? Not everybody had Titans at this time, but to see all those things move was really impressive.
But the flip side of it, and I'll just give credit to Lord Servant out there for what he said. The flip side of not being able to go out there and project power, right, or even just momentary power, right, was the fact that now you basically solidified home zones, right, because chances are the other side wasn't going to move around the horn to come get you. There was no longer the PL boogeyman, as he says. There wasn't the boogeyman of anybody except within your own area. So it really led to a castling effect out there, in a number of areas.
Yeah, and I remember that specifically because I was trying to think, like, when did NC or Northern Associates come to kind of take over Delve and that kind of thing. And like what reminded me was the fact that the jump changes basically meant that we, like, as the CFC, were like far too stretched out. We were far too sort of spread out, and that we actually ceded that territory specifically because the amount of movement involved in order to actually to solidify a defense in that area was just so colossal that you couldn't. So we ceded territory back into Fountain and let NC. And Northern Associates take it. So yeah,
right. Groups got smaller on purpose to meet the expectations of the limitations of their force projection. So yeah, they abandoned territory. I think CFC gave up 2 regions and moved up north, basically giving up Delve. That's when NC moves into Delve and starts poking around Fountain, but FA is still in Fountain, I believe. So you have a little bit of changes, but it's basically solidifying. People are waiting for this new SOV system. It finally arrives. People, I don't know if they knew what to make of it. A lot of people liked it. A lot of people didn't like it, but it was breaking everything down into what CCP was trying to do was make it so there's a lot more skirmishes for wars rather than set piece battles where everything happens in one big fight.
Correct. That was supposed to be the thing. An offshoot of that was also to allow smaller groups. Okay, I don't mean smaller groups to take and hold sovereignty, but smaller groups to be able to be involved with at least a portion of sovereignty warfare, whether it just be out there, attacking something to see if you'll come out and fight or not, right? It wasn't meant to be a situation where smaller groups could more easily take and hold it, but they could at least be involved with it with something, less than going out, laying down SBUs, waiting for those to anchor, and then basically, attacking large structures.
Yeah, there's some complex SOV mechanic changes because you have Dominion SOV, which is now out, and the territorial claim units were the keys to those systems. But now the territorial claim unit is just a fuel saver, basically. It's nothing. It's just your name on the map, but it doesn't really mean anything. The real power is in these iHubs, these infrastructure hubs that are now needed to be invested in by doing not just fighting, but mining and also ratting. So those are the reasons you have these things called, I think something defense. What are they called?
Nodes?
No, not the nodes. The ADMs. What's the something defense rate?
The activity defense multipliers. Yeah, activity defense
multiplier.
But since we're at 2015, we're technically halfway through the decade. I do want to just go back and say this. What we've talked about here is a lot of what I will call, obviously the nullsec activity of the time, right? We haven't talked about things like Monocle Gate. We haven't talked about things like, Incarna and the Summer of Rage and things like that, which I believe are covered so often, but they really are kind of, in the background, led to a lot of things in a different angle. But I got to be honest, what I really wanted to highlight in talking about this most recent decade, at least the first half of it, was at least what I perceived to be the level of activity that was going on out there, the wars that were taking place, the conflict that was happening. And granted, this is null-centric, okay? It just tends to be, without actually getting into some of those more, I don't know, stories of, did the CSM get mad at Hilmar or something?
Yeah. There's the social events that happen in the meta are interesting. You have essentially 2011 is a change in direction for CCP's development. They say, let's balance this game and fix the game more than create new features, new gameplay. So you have planetary interaction is one of the last, or incursion is one of the last things that are like new gameplay. Now you have, over those 4 years, it's just a fixing and balancing and making the game run better. And so you have technological advances and you have mechanical advances in the way things happen in the game. And you also see Hilmar essentially take a hike and start to do these other things. You see Dust essentially come and then kind of go. It didn't really... it didn't connect as well as they thought that it would connect to it. And again, I think by this time, Hilmar's, I think the other companion product to EVE Online was World of Darkness. And at this point, World of Darkness is also folding and no longer going to be a thing. It's sold off as a different property to other people. So the point is, there's a lot going on outside the game, but the general attitude is fix the spaceship game. That's what we play. And that's what they were doing, not at the same time all this is happening, but it kind of overlaps, right? Well, 2012 to then 16.
Yeah, man, look, there were changes that began to come in, and again, this is going to be very, very null-centric, because obviously there was a period of years there where it was really about, changes that primarily affected null, or at least those areas, with capitals and super capitals, and where structures mattered much more and all that, right? But there were also, I believe the second half of the decade was a hangover period from the first half of the decade, where you had such a buildup of extreme, I don't know if you want to call it, ISK and resources and everything else that then poured into the second half of the decade and then accelerated that even though they were making changes out there, it wasn't necessarily changing what I think was still a perceived kind of level of stagnation.
Yeah. Well, okay. At this point, we're halfway through the decade. New SOV has just hit. Do you guys want to finish this tomorrow, or do you want to try to cram it into this
tomorrow?
Because it's New Year's. What are you doing for New Year's? Because I got to go pretty soon unless you want to continue without me, which is totally fine.
No, many of us here. No, I mean,
if Elise comes back,
maybe we can get together tomorrow. I don't know what tomorrow morning is going to look like.
Dealing with a hangover, that's what's going to be happening tomorrow.
I'm surprised McLeod's not already tapping him up, but
I'm free tomorrow. If you want to continue, we can give it a proper hour and a half, 2 hours to do the second 5 years. I just don't know if there's enough in there.
Look, I think the one thing we haven't gotten to yet is Casino War B, World War B, the Casino War, whatever whatever you want to call it out there, which was a rather substantial thing that happened in 2006 around this 2016 around the same time as they released the Citadel release and the changes to capitals and super capitals and the introduction of Citadels. Obviously, it was a big thing. Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. Past that point, I'm just not sure yet.
I mean, to be fair, I named it as like my event of the decade, the dethroning of Imperium in the North.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because look, with what they owned up there, and we're either going to go into it or we're not. But
hold on, let's decide that quick. McLeod, can you come back tomorrow with this?
Oh, I can. Yeah, yeah.
Let's do this again tomorrow, same time. Dirk, you're here. That's good. Now let's preview what happens, and then we'll go.
See, 12 o'clock noon my time. This might be a little early tomorrow.
You're right. Maybe a little bit later. Okay, but let's preview what happens in the second 5 years. You have, essentially you have World War B, which is, remember, BTAC-R happened. And so you have Pandemic Legion, and especially NC. really wants to take that bite out of CFC that they want to do in 2014. And they're waiting for that opportunity. And here comes this infusion of money and infusion of people and interest. And so that's what leads up to World War B, the attack on the North, where CFC is sitting there, making money, sitting back, enjoying their victories of the first half of the decade. And it works. They get displaced, they head south, and then there are new lords in the North. NC. finally gets to be Northern Coalition up there again, since that's what they were trying to do the whole time, is live up there. And so that is the status quo for a while. But then North starts to fall apart because you need movement, and they start to fight amongst each other. Notably, Test and CO2 get knocked down to the south, where FCON is living. And so there's fights down there for territory, and you see the rise of Test Alliance and Legacy. We skipped over Brave, but that's, I guess, okay. And then you have the Russians kind of start to slowly decay out of loss of interest, I think. And then you have what we would call the modern era of EVE Online, and that is the Test and Imperium now, because they changed the name from CFC to Imperium. You have them kind of group up instead of fight each other, and you see them resist Pandemic Legion, which has gotten weaker over time because the gameplay has gone away from their style of play. Northern Coalition adapts by growing into a much bigger alliance than they were, and they run the North with Sword Dragon essentially farming the hell out of the North. And that stays that way for a while. There's some skirmishes between a new group that comes up because of Chinese players that are entering the game. And Test, they get into a fight. Russians actually get killed in the mix, pretty much. And that war starts to begin. It pauses for a while. And then the big wars happen in 2018, where you have essentially the Northern Powers, NC, PL again. You have Horde, this new group that's grown out of the ashes of Brave, the first rendition of Brave. You have Karma Fleet born inside of CFC, the Imperium, or Goonswarm, which grows as well. A lot of new players. So these groups get really, really big, and they go to war all through 2018. And those are some of the biggest fights that EVE has ever seen, and pretty dramatic. But also, it hit the limitations of the game. The servers were crashing, even with tie-dye. They couldn't handle 6,000 people inside of one system, and you see a real turnover in power, where essentially the CFC and Test together can match PL, NC, and everybody else. And those two sides go to war. I think basically NCPL end up just not being able to, they no longer have that upper hand. And that is a real leveling that's happened over the last decade. And that happens in 2018. And probably the moment that it really crystallizes is the Battle of UALX, which is a massive battle. And that happens it happens that Test wins that battle. They did not know they were going to win. They could have been destroyed and killed, but they did win it. And PL is really at that point wounded, I think, just spiritually wounded as an entity. And NC Dot is also, they couldn't help in that fight either. But that was the big turning point. And I think what we're seeing now in the modern era is almost like remnants of that. And that's when it starts to slow down, you see CCP want to get involved to kind of churn it, because you need that churn in order to create activity. And that's when you see the drifters attack. And that's when you see Blackout. And that's when you see CCP making moves to make the place more exciting.
Yeah, I think there were a number of factors that come in there. And again, it goes back to my belief that, there were excesses that just allowed to become excesses, that allowed to become super excesses, and things along those lines. I almost don't even want to call it a leveling. And you referred to a leveling. And really what I think it was running up against a concrete ceiling that just over time, the numbers just all pushed up to basically the same level. And it was all just a numbers game at that point.
Yes, the numbers game is what signifies the last 3 or 4 years of EVE Online, which is why you see these massive groups and why it's important to keep them together. Okay, so we got to wrap up, but we can't wrap up without talking about the most important or most influential or most valuable players of EVE Online. And we should really, I wish we could do like a 5-hour show and talk about all these guys, but we're not. I'm just going to name off some names and we'll talk a little bit about what they did and why they're important to this year. So 2019, most influential players, as far as Talking in Station's point of view, and we look at this stuff all the time, we have to look at people like, and here's the list, Olmeca Gold. He won an amazing victory for CSM, caught the imagination of some people, but coming in third place is no small thing for an independent candidate. Big win there. He's also somebody with a huge amount of imagination, and he's created and really, or brought to the forefront and surface this play style called whaling. It's always been there, but he's also made it more interesting to watch and to know about. You also have Kendar. Kendar broke off of the Imperium and started his own thing up north called Trigger Happy, and they're basically this year's version of Skill Yourself, where it's an exciting place to be. It's a fun place to be. They like the style of the combat, and people really want to go and be a part of that. It's gotten a lot of attention. You can't look at 2019 without looking at this as a year for Vili. Vili is leader of Test. He's also done some things diplomatically that are really amazing. He put together he took over the perimeter market from Horde. He took it over from them, and then he negotiated with them to make that happen. But further, in the summer, he negotiated a treaty basically between, I'll call it a treaty, it's not official, between Gobbins and Mittani. I know that Mittani did not like Gobbins at all. Anytime you bring up his name, he'd roll his eyes. And Gobbins, I don't know what he thought of Mittani, but to bring them into the table and to make them cooperate over this money-making machine in high-sec was no small task, and I think that is really interesting. You also have to look at the war that happened in the South, which worked all through 2019 between Winter Coalition and Legacy Coalition, and one of the leaders of that war for the Winter side of things was Elo Knight, who essentially was on day in, day out, just managing that war like a machine. And he was a big part of Winter's defenses and Winter's ability to stay competitive in that war for a long time, for months and months and months. And on the other side, you have Sado, who's the FC for Test, who was also running a lot of the stuff for Test in that war. These are all the names that you should know about, but probably the greatest name in 2019 comes not in the form of a combat person, but in the form of somebody who completed a decades-long task, and that is Katya Saya. And I think I always say that wrong.
I guess just say.
Katya
maybe
Say.
I don't know.
No, it is. I just say it wrong all the time. Katya Say, who is our player of the year for accomplishing traveling to every system in EVE Online, including Wormhole systems, and doing it in stealth mode and not dying ever. In other words, there were times where she was stuck in systems and not able to escape for days and days because people were hunting her. And so doing that is no small task. It's not just an issue of traveling, it's an issue of traveling and doing it in a way where you don't actually get killed. So that is the 2019 Person of the Year.
And you know what? I'm going to be honest. I think it's a good person to pick, even though it was the culmination of almost a decade's work, I think. The fact that it happened this year, very rarely are you probably going to hear people talk about, let's call it, a player of the year sort of thing, being somebody who didn't have anything to do with combat.
And I think it's amazing that, in this day and age, you can still do like firsts in EVE, even though EVE is like, Jesus Christ, what, 15, 16 years old?
Yeah. Right. So there's one person I forgot to mention, and that is Gobbins. Gobbins in there.
But he's taken Gobbins.
I mentioned him, but only as Villy coordinating with him. But I meant to. I skipped.
And Matani not liking him at first or something.
Yeah. That's.
You had a bunch of references to Gobbins that apparently weren't what you meant to say.
No, because what Gobbins did on his own behalf was basically build up this small group of new players into Horde, which now is one of, if not the dominant voice in NCPL. So Horde used to be the little brother. PL didn't even want to participate with Horde on anything. It was NC, the uncle, that was like, yeah, we'll have you along. Come on, we'll take care of you. And that relationship has totally changed now, and that is a tribute to Gobbin's ability to grow that group and also to work in a dynamic that is very, very difficult, right? Because growing a group is one thing. Let's say Villy has done that. Let's say Matani has done that. But Gobbins has grown a group inside of a very established area between PL and NC. Not that easy to do. And he's done it. He's done it very well, and he's got himself in a good position there. They could have at many times been destroyed, but they're guided. I think Gobbin's strategy and the FCs that work there for him have done a good job. Okay. Let's look at Group of the Year. You have Trigger Happy, of course. That's Kendar's group up north. Against, they're the darlings of nullsec right now. People really like what's going on there. They don't want to bring attention to themselves because they're having a lot of fun. We also want to highlight Inner Hell. Inner Hell is a wormhole group that is evicting the heck out of wormhole space right now. Streamfleet, who did a number of presentations.
Wasn't Inner Hell also the first one to lose a keep star in Wormholes? Wasn't that the first wormhole keep star that got killed?
I believe there was.
There's
not this year, but I think it was
I don't think it was Inner Hell. I think it was there's a different Hell group.
I'm pretty sure it was Inner Hell. I think wasn't it Hard Knocks that knocked it out? Like, it wasn't really defended, but
that might have been. I can't say for sure, but I thought Hard Knocks. So Hard Knocks wasn't the first keep star destroyed in Wormhole space. No. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think. Well, as Lord Servant says, I think they were out evicting. like they had already kind of, I guess, moved on from that place, but it was there. I think it was the first keep star in a wormhole to be killed. Not necessarily saying it was the biggest battle or anything along those lines.
Right. Okay, and then so you also have Streamfleet, and you have Korean players basically that have come into the group and totally bolstered the time zone, which was fascinating to watch.
I saw this on here with the Korean players. Okay, and I guess I'm glad to see that because of Korean localization and the CCP getting bought by PA and all that kind of stuff, Korean players have come into forefront. I just remember more of a theme of Chinese players this year than Korean players.
Well, to be fair, though, when I was, I know that I kind of put this down as one of my picks, but my pick was based on most valuable event for EVE Online. So in that regard, I kind of thought it was very valuable for EVE Online.
Okay, so
But influential, that's different. That's different.
This year, I think you have to look at, and we probably should have given it to Skill U last year, but Test had done so much in so many different ways. But this year, it's going to go to Trigger Happy because they have basically become what people have been interested in.
Up in the north there?
Yes.
I don't know. I just get the feeling that needs to play out a little bit longer to show that it is, solidified and it's something that's going to, be lasting in some way. I think with what happened, it is my own personal opinion. I think with what happened this year, you got to give it to Test Legacy for number one. Continuing their war throughout the entire Drifter Menace and the Blackout and everything else. I think that was the war of the year over there that was going on. And so therefore you've also got to give credit to the other side, for continuing as well. But
it was, but I think that Trigger Happy is sparking the imagination of players who are really disillusioned right now. And they are harboring a lot of those players. So I think it's interesting. It is a little bit a bet into the future, which we did the first year we did this with Triumvirate. It was a bet into,
into the future.
Not Triumvirate, but it was Initiative that was like...
You should have a wishful thinking like category or something then.
Yeah. Last thing is event Blackout was a big event that happened. You also had a very interesting fight that happened at 01YED, and that was Snuff versus Dead Coalition, which was the beginning of some of the Blackout changes. It happened during Blackout, so it was a big fight during Blackout, and Snuff got surprised, I think. So that was interesting to see. You have Pittsburgh, an FC for the Imperium that basically was kicked out, but he came back to avenge that by taking out a Locust fleet, or at least a third of it or a half of it. You had a treaty and faction war, which was interesting. You had Miss Rabbit apparently buying, but that seemed to be overblown. Miss Rabbit was a Chinese player that bought influence into a group in the north called Range Regiment, another Chinese group. So the very interesting stuff happening on the Chinese side of the game, very interesting. You also saw the death of a Golden Magnet, very rare ship. And of course, you have the Brisk expulsion from CSM, which was a big debacle that almost took down Initiative, which was unbelievable. The big part of that was, it has many levels that it works on, but the big part of that for me was seeing the Initiative FCs get taken out. That's essentially a death blow to Initiative's power, and they were a big player. They were the player, Panda was a player of the year last year, so it was a big deal. And then you have the Imperium Glassing Tribute, which was a big deal, even though it didn't get a lot of coverage because it was kind of already known that it was going to happen. And what followed that was Drifter attacks by CCP. So obviously, I think this year we can all agree the biggest thing that happened was Blackout.
I don't know. I would say it was the Brisk incident. You know why? Because I think it was indicative of a lot of things that happened this year.
the example.
It was like the example of just how messed up some shit was in 2019.
Right, the whole community team is gone now. There's a new community team. There's a lot of stuff going on. All right, that's all we have time for today. I am late. I got to take off, and we will be back tomorrow to do the second half, 5 years, 2016 through 2020, and because it will be January 1st, so we can end 2020, and we will also tell you who the most influential players were of the decade. And of course, we're going to have people like Matani on that list, but you also see maybe a Gig X, maybe a Minxie. We'll talk about groups that were big in the decade, like maybe Rooks and Kings and Eve Uni. And we'll talk about events like BTEC R, which we talked about today, and maybe the Rage Eviction, maybe that Voyage of Katya Se. Check that out. See tomorrow when we come back and do the second half of this decade in review. I want to thank Elise for hanging out with us and early on. He was terrific. I want to thank McLeod for doing all the engineering and talking with us. I want to thank you guys, Dirk McGurk, and of course, thanks to the audience. Any last words, Dirk?
Now, just Happy New Year, everybody. I don't know, walk carefully or whatever it is you're doing tonight. But, here's to looking towards a really good New Year, and God bless. Or whatever, bliss, like, you know what I'm talking about. Can't even talk right now.
Yeah.
Too much fucking coffee. I gotta go to the bathroom.
Me too. We gotta go.
I am having a beer for you, so cheers.
There you go. Have a great New Year's Eve, guys. We'll see you New Year's Day. Take care from Talking in Stations. We'll see you next time.